the victory in Europe, and rejoicing all over the world is the greater because of the recollection of the triumphs of Nazi barbarism and its final overthrow.
But the celebrations didn't last long. World War II had left a trail of destruction in Europe, killing 36 million people, many of them civilians, and displacing millions.
1945. World War II is over. Europe lies in ruins, its cities shattered, and its people struggling for survival. Entire nations were picking through the wreckage of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Over 36 million Europeans killed, millions more displaced. Wandering roads lined with the ruins of once thriving cities. In Hamburg alone, 500,000 people homeless. Across the continent, rationing is a way of life. Food was scarce, economies collapsed, and entire nations teeter on the brink of political and social chaos. But while Europe struggled to rebuild, a new threat was already taking shape. From the east, the Soviet Union watched. With its powerful Red Army and growing influence, Joseph Stalin's regime casts a long shadow over the war-ravaged nations of Europe. The communist ideology it championed was spreading rapidly, taking root in the shattered remains of struggling democracies. In 1948, Czechoslovakia fell. The Communist Party, backed by the Soviet Union, topples the elected government in Prague. His stark warning to the West: democracy is fragile, and the Soviet Union is ready to exploit that weakness. In June 1948, Stalin attempts to force the Western Allies out of Berlin by cutting off all land and rail access to the city. His disparate population was suddenly trapped. 2 million men, women, and children without food, fuel, or supplies. The world watched, waiting for war. But the West did not surrender. For nearly a year, Allied aircraft flew around the clock, landing a plane every minute to keep West Berlin alive. It was one of the greatest feats of logistics in history, the Berlin airlift. The message was clear: the Soviet Union will not stop. Something had to be done. Europe must be defended. But the war had left nations weak. Alone, they couldn't stand against the Soviet giant. And so, they united. On April 4, 1949, 12 nations, including the United States and Canada, sign an agreement that will change the course of history. The North Atlantic Treaty. At its core was a simple but powerful promise: an attack on one is an attack on all. This was NATO. Its purpose: to stop Soviet expansion, to ensure Europe never falls into war again, and to create a bond between North America and Europe, one strong enough to deter aggression. But a signature on paper was not enough. The question remained: could NATO hold? At first, NATO was a political agreement, a mutual promise of defense. But when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, everything changed. The Cold War had begun. In 1950, war broke out in Korea. Brutal proxy battle between communism and democracy erupted, proving that the world was still on the edge of conflict. For NATO, the stakes became clear. Words were not enough. It had to prepare for war. A military structure was created, with a supreme headquarters based in Paris. Its first commander, a war hero of World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The mission: build a force strong enough to stop any Soviet invasion. NATO rapidly expanded its army, stationing Americans, Brits, and other Allied troops across Europe. New nations joined in. In 1952, Greece and Turkey became members. In 1955, West Germany followed. The Soviet response was swift. Moscow formed the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of communist states, standing opposite NATO in an uneasy, hostile balance of power. With the Cold War intensifying, NATO adopted a new doctrine, one that would define the next decades of global strategy. If the Soviet Union attacked NATO, even with conventional forces, the response would be overwhelming. It was a high-stakes gamble. On one hand, this strategy deterred war. Any Soviet attack could mean instant nuclear catastrophe. On the other, it locked the world into a terrifying equation. Any conflict, even a small one, could lead to total destruction. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Cold War was at its most dangerous. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. East and West Berlin were violently divided, becoming the ultimate symbol of the Cold War standoff. Then, a new crisis emerged, one that could end the world as we know it. The Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962. Soviet nuclear missiles were discovered in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The United States demanded the missiles be removed, but the Soviet Union refused. NATO allies held their breath. At the last moment, diplomacy prevailed. The missiles were withdrawn. War was averted. But one fact was clear: massive retaliation means the world is always one step away from annihilation. As the Cold War continued, NATO had to evolve. The 1960s brought a new doctrine. Instead of relying solely on nuclear weapons, NATO built its conventional forces. It prepared for a range of responses, from diplomacy to full-scale war. Yet, the alliance was not without its struggles. In 1966, France withdrew from NATO's military command. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The once mighty superpower, and NATO's greatest rival, was no more. For NATO, this was a moment of triumph. The alliance had fulfilled its mission. The Soviet threat had vanished. But now, NATO faced a new question. Does it still have a purpose? With no Soviet Union to fight, NATO had to redefine itself. Some argued the alliance should be dissolved, since it was built for the Cold War, which was now over. But others saw a different path. Instead of disbanding, NATO decided to expand. Former Eastern Bloc countries, once under Soviet influence, now sought protection under NATO's umbrella. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic became members. In 2004, 7 more nations joined, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former Soviet republics. For NATO, expansion was a sign of strength, a way to stabilize Eastern Europe and prevent new conflicts. But for Russia, it was betrayal. Moscow claimed that after the Cold War, Western leaders made a promise: NATO would not expand toward Russian borders. And now, it seemed that promise was broken. NATO's new focus was maintaining peace and stability in Europe. But the post-Cold War era was anything but peaceful. In 1995, NATO launched its first military operation, bombing Serbian forces in Bosnia. The goal: to stop ethnic violence. In 1999, another conflict erupts in Kosovo. Serbian forces were accused of ethnic cleansing. NATO responded with an 11-week bombing campaign. The message was clear: NATO was no longer just a defensive alliance. It was willing to intervene in conflicts to preserve peace and prevent genocide. But not all wars could be prevented. And soon, NATO had to face its greatest test yet. For over 50 years, NATO's foundation had rested on collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. But this principle had never been tested, until now. On September 11, 2001, terrorist hijackers flew planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. For the first time in history, NATO invoked Article 5. The United States had been attacked, and its allies stood ready to fight. NATO launched a military campaign in Afghanistan, targeting the Taliban regime that harbored al-Qaeda. The alliance's mission was clear: eliminate the terrorist threat. For the next 20 years, NATO forces remained in Afghanistan. But despite years of fighting, the war dragged on. In 2021, NATO finally withdrew. The Taliban quickly retook power, and many wondered, was the war really worth it? As NATO fought in Afghanistan, a new threat emerged in Europe. In 2014, Russian troops invaded and annexed Crimea, a region of Ukraine. For NATO, this was a direct challenge to European stability. Troops were deployed to NATO's eastern border. New sanctions were placed on Russia, but NATO did not directly intervene. In 2022, Russia escalates this, leading to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Tanks rolled toward Kiev. Cities were bombed, and millions fled. It was the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. For NATO, the challenge was critical. Ukraine was not a NATO member, and so there was no legal obligation to defend it. But if Russia succeeds, where will it stop? Billions of dollars in weapons and aid flew into Ukraine. NATO forces did not enter the fight. The risk was clear: a direct NATO-Russia war could escalate into nuclear conflict. Instead, NATO strengthens its defenses across Poland, the Baltic states, and Eastern Europe. Any attack on a NATO country would be met with full force, even as NATO confronted Russia. Another rising power loomed in the East. For decades, China had built its military strength, expanded its influence, and positioned itself as a global superpower. Beijing had built the world's largest navy, having militarized islands in the South China Sea. Their intention was clear: Taiwan will one day be part of China. For the first time, NATO officially named China as a strategic threat. But if you can remember, NATO was a North Atlantic alliance. Would it intervene if China moved on Taiwan? For now, the answer remains uncertain, but NATO has been watching, because as history had shown, global threats do not stay confined to one region. Even as NATO faced threats from Russia and China, the alliance was not without internal divisions. Some European nations questioned NATO's reliance on the United States. The US funded nearly 70% of NATO's total military spending. Without American leadership, could NATO survive? In recent years, some US leaders have even threatened to withdraw from NATO. If the United States ever left, it's likely the alliance would be crippled. Other challenges remained. Turkey, a NATO member, had grown closer to Russia. Several European nations failed to meet NATO's defense spending goals. The alliance faced political divisions over strategy and leadership. And as military threats grow, NATO must ask itself, does every member still share the same vision? For 75 years, NATO had endured wars, crises, and political turmoil. It had deterred Soviet aggression, fought terrorism, and expanded its reach. But today, NATO's challenges are greater than ever. Resurgent Russia willing to use force to expand its power. A rising China challenging the global balance. And also internal divisions threatening the alliance's unity. The world is no longer the same as it was in 1949. And the question remains, is NATO still strong enough to defend the West? The answer will not come from speeches or policies. It will come from actions. Because in the modern world, security is never guaranteed. And NATO's greatest test may still be yet to come.